Sorry everyone, welcome back to Gaelic Games Fan TV. How are we all getting on? How is the form? And in this video, we're going to be discussing Louth Football and what a year it's been for Louth Football. I mean, for them to actually have gone and won the Leinster Senior Football Championship, their first since 1957. They became just the second county other than Meath and Dublin to win a Leinster title since 2004. I mean, that's absolutely wild. Absolutely crazy. I mean, could you imagine like 5, 6, 7 years ago when Dublin were dominating through Leinster? You were thinking, right, Dublin are probably going to win 15, 20 in a row. Could you have ever imagined back then that the team to break Dublin's dominance would technically be Louth? I mean, yes, Meath were actually the team that went and beat them in Portlaoise a couple of weeks ago, but history will remember winners, and history will remember that Louth were the team after Dublin. Dublin's 14 in a row spell, and it's absolutely mental and wild, to be honest with you. And you know what, following on from the game, and having watched the game back, having been there and sort of been in Croke Park and sort of soaking up the atmosphere, even while I was actually at the game, I thought, if Louth win this Leinster title, I need to make a video and just go back and try and understand and put the pieces of the jigsaw together as to how Louth have actually gone and done this, because in my opinion, like, this is one of the greatest provincial wins of all time, and I think it's not really... It is getting credit, and a lot of people are speaking about it and everything else in the GA community, but I think a lot of people probably don't understand how big of a deal that this actually is. I mean, it was only 5 or 6 years ago that you had the likes of Andy McEntee and Pat Gilroy on national television on the Sunday game debating how to actually stop Dublin win the Leinster Championship and how to actually fix the provincial championships and everything else. Hell, even John Kennellan, a Westmeath footballer, like, he even wrote an open letter to the GEA, basically saying how Dublin had so much funding and they needed to be split into two and everything else. And look, maybe they still do. I don't know. That's not what we're here to discuss today. Obviously, we're here to discuss Louth Football and what they've achieved. But lads, like 6 years ago, right, Dublin played Louth in a Leinster quarterfinal. I remember being at that game, and Dublin beat Louth by 26 points. And I remember, like, coming out of that ground, if someone had told me that in 6 years' time, when Dublin lose in Leinster, that it would be Louth who would actually go on and win the Leinster title, you know, absolutely mental, to be honest. Yeah, I just said, you know what, I have to go back and actually see how on earth have they managed to put this together. Because the thing about Louth Football right now, lads, is that, yes, they have won the Leinster Senior Football Championship for the first time in 68 years. They also went and won the Under-20 Leinster Football Championship for the first time in 44 years. In this absolute rise from a county, like, don't get me wrong, we've saw counties in the last couple of years rise up. I mean, Tipperary was a great example of that, and they went on to win a Munster title. We saw Derry do it to a certain extent over the last couple of years, winning a couple of Ulster titles. Now, football, to be fair, has always been a strong place in Derry, and they probably should have never gone as low as they did. We've saw Carlow have a bit of a rise. Longford have kind of had a bit of resurgence. You go back 20 years, Westmeath have done it, Laois have done it. I mean, even Louth in 2010 had a bit of a rise then, right, and getting to a Leinster final. But this, like, feels a little bit unprecedented, to be honest with you. And this feels a little bit different. And even doing my research and actually looking into this, like, lads, Louth Football could be on a serious crest of a wave here. Like, I'm not just talking about Leinster titles. And All-Ireland is not out of the realms of possibility. Now, slow down. I'm not talking about this year or next year, but in a couple of years, it genuinely could happen. Very briefly mentioning, like, the history of Louth Football, because I think it's important to kind of start that. Not necessarily the beginning, and I don't want to fucking bore people to death with this, but look, Louth Football in general, like, it's fair to say it was not a stronghold. Like, interesting enough, actually, pre-1957, when they won that Leinster title, like, when they won the Leinster title in 1957, it was actually their 8th title that they won. So they actually have been, you know, quite good in regards to that. And even when it comes to All-Irelands as well, like, they've actually won 3 All-Irelands. The last one was actually in 1957, coincidentally, as well. And, for, you know, I don't want to throw shade here, but they actually won an All-Ireland more recently than Mayo. But generally speaking, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, Louth were pretty decent, right? They were winning Leinster titles. Obviously, football was probably different back then. I mean, as you can tell, it might sound a shock, but it wasn't actually around back then. I mean, maybe you were. If you were, fair fucks, I mean, maybe you should go and do something else with the rest of your life than watching this fucking video. But generally speaking, Louth Football kind of, the more that time went on, the more that Dublin obviously grew into what they were and being the capital county. And of course, Meath and Kildare and these other counties all started to come to the resurgence. Louth fell off. And of course, let's not forget as well that Louth is one of the smallest counties in Ireland. I think in terms of actual size, it is the smallest county in Ireland. Its population has grown massively over the last couple of years, but it is one of the smallest counties in Ireland. And throughout history as well, looking through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. I mean, Louth were no different to the likes of Carlow now, the likes of Longford, the likes of Wicklow, these counties. I mean, Louth were more or less in and around that. And actually, as a matter of fact, between the years of 2014 to 2022, Louth only won 3 games in Leinster. 2 of them were against Carlow and 1 of them were against Wicklow. So that even puts it into perspective that, like, you know, and that's going back very recently, right? 2022 was only a couple of years ago. So that actually shows you the body of work that's actually gone into Louth football. Now, a lot of people will look at 2010 and, you know, interestingly, like looking back at 2010, and I know this whole scenario has been covered plenty of times on this channel, like, it was one of them for Louth football. They had a lot of senior players. They had a lot of experienced players. They had some brilliant players, obviously, in the likes of JP Rooney, but it wasn't like a sustained period of success. It wasn't like they were even building towards it necessarily. I mean, they sort of just went on this incredible run, beating the likes of Kildare and Westmeath in that championship. And as we know, should have beat Meath if it hadn't been for the culprits. But look, as we all know, the ghost is put to bed, and even Peter Fitzpatrick said that himself. And yeah, like, that was just one of them years where it all kind of came together, and sometimes that can happen as well. But you saw, following on from 2010, Louth very much struggled, and very quickly they were back to sort of the default setting. And as I said, between the years of 2014 to 2022, just 3 wins in the Leinster Senior Football Championship. And what's mad to think is, even as recently as 2020, they were relegated from Division 3. They lost every game in Division 3, and then they lost to Longford in the Leinster Senior Football Championship in the opening game. And what's more bizarre is that in that game, Louth scored 1-7, and it was all scored by one player. You want to guess who? Sam Mulroy. And the interesting thing about all this story is I actually interviewed Sam Mulroy not long after this game, to be honest with you. If someone had told me back then that, you know, what was going to happen, you know, again, you couldn't have believed. And I even remember in the interview, like, trying to bring up the Leinster Football Championship. I knew I couldn't just point blank ask Sam, like, oh, do you think you'll ever win the Leinster Championship? Because it sounded absolutely crazy. It sounded ludicrous. And I think I did sort of ask him in a weird way, and it just felt awkward. But that was how it was back then, and it would have been no different to asking a Wicklow footballer or a Carlow footballer. And again, this is not, you know, me trying to discredit them counties or by any stretch of the imagination, but that was just the reality of it. And that just kind of, in my opinion, put into perspective the size of this achievement for Louth football, and also as well for Wicklow, Carlow, Longford, these counties, maybe counties in other provinces as well. They can look at this and think, maybe we need to look at what they're doing, because clearly they're doing something right. When I was doing my research and I was going down the rabbit hole of Louth football, I came across a few things that really, I think, have stood out in terms of Louth getting to this stage. And I think one thing that really stands out is Peter Fitzpatrick. So people who won't know, Peter Fitzpatrick was the manager of Louth football in 2010, and he actually obviously was manager and got them to that final and everything else that went on and blah, 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 blah. But he left that management role a couple of years later, but he did since come back, but he actually came back as the county chairman, and that actually happened in 2019. And I remember when this happened as well, and I was thinking, you know, fair play to him for coming back. And obviously he must have felt like he had a score to settle. And I'd imagine he sipped on a lovely bottle of champagne, you know, when that football, and actually, funny enough, he was actually only sitting a couple of rows behind me in the Hogan stand. I did actually see him, so that was kind of interesting to kind of see him in there. But incredible stuff for him to come in there, and without question, like, since he's come in, Louth have made a lot of very, very good decisions. There's been investment in facilities, in underage. There's been vast amount of promotion in schools, and without doubt, they've been able to keep their best players playing in the county as well, which I think has been massive. A lot of their players, you know, you see this a lot of the time with Louth, maybe with Carlow, Leitrim, you know, other counties, even some of the bigger counties. You know, players will get poached by AFL, they get poached by other sports, and it can very easily happen. And sometimes all it takes is 1 or 2 players to come out of the cog, and something can completely unravel. Young players in the side, they didn't go traveling or anything like that. They all stuck around. And without question, you know, the development squads and the setup that Louth football were able to introduce was able to keep all these players on side. And I think that's very impressive. And look, a big part of it as well has to go down in 2020 when they appointed Mickey Hart as the Louth senior football manager. Gavin Devlin came in as the assistant as well. Everyone knows who Mickey Hart is. He won multiple All-Irelands as Tyrone manager. It was mad as well when he got appointed, because when he left Tyrone, I think everyone just assumed that he was going to retire. I remember people writing up like retirement pieces and everything else, and people just thought that he was gonna, he was gonna be done, because the idea of him not managing, or the idea of him managing anyone else other than Tyrone seemed a little bit bizarre. But he came to Louth, and he came in as Louth football manager. Without question, Mickey Hart and Gavin Devlin, they made a huge impact. Mickey Hart was put in charge of the under-20s as well, so he was in charge of the seniors, but also the under-20s, and Gavin Devlin definitely played a massive part in that, from what I'm led to believe. And Louth started to soar up the divisions. I mean, in 2021, they were promoted from Division 4 alongside Antrim, and then in 2022, they were promoted from Division 3 as champions as well. They won the Division 3 title in Croke Park. And what an achievement that was at the time as well for Louth football. And the growth just didn't stop there. I mean, younger players were coming in. Mickey Hart wasn't afraid to throw some of the under-20 players in. And you were seeing some of these faces making impacts within the Louth team. Of course, starlights like Samuel Roy and Tommy Durnan were all sticking around and making a huge impact for this Louth side. And Louth were rising, even in Division 2 in 2023. I remember a lot of people thought they would instantly get relegated and go straight back down. They finished third, and they actually took Dublin to the final day in Croke Park. And had they have actually won that game, they would have been promoted ahead of Dublin. And it was actually a closer game than people expected. I remember watching that. Interesting to see Louth give Dublin such a good game. And the progress was happening with Louth football. They kicked on. They got to the Leinster final that season. It was a disappointing Leinster final from their perspective. They lost by 21 points, and it must have felt like a massive sort of setback, given that Dublin had nearly actually got bet by Kildare the week previous, and it felt like Louth actually had a massive chance coming into that game. And then, speaking of setbacks, Mickey Hart and Gavin Devlin leave, and even then, you're thinking, right, I think Louth football are going to struggle here. They're going to go back down. They're going to, revert to type. They're going to go, back down the divisions. Ger Brennan comes in, and even at the time, I was thinking as a Dublin fan, I want Ger Brennan to succeed. I've met him a couple of times. He's a lovely man, and I would certainly love him to be a Dublin manager in the future. And you were thinking, look, I hope it goes well, but it's the unknown, right? It's a man coming in for his first inter-county management job. I've listened to him on podcasts as well. I remember when he was on Smaller Fish GA for a good couple of years. And here he is now taking over the Louth hot seat. And it felt like it was, how can he actually improve this team? How can he actually kick them on and make them better? But goodness me, he's taken them on even another level. And the thing I love about Louth under Ger Brennan in particular is their tactical flexibility. And you can see the sort of Ger Brennan blueprint all over this team. And it stems from a bit of Pat Gilroy. I think you can tell he's learned so much from his time playing under Pat Gilroy, because Louth, so often the structure of how they would play football, the movement, the way they would keep the ball, they would revert back into that defensive shell as well and be very, very hard to beat. And I think people forget that Dublin often under Pat Gilroy, they wouldn't be as defensive as, say, in those particular moments when you think back to Louth in the Leinster final last year. But they would be very, very hard to beat, and they certainly would shut up shop when they needed to be. And that was no different from a Louth perspective when they got back to the Leinster final last year in 2024. They beat Kildare along the way, which was a massive win, obviously, to beat their rivals and get back to a Leinster final. And this time around against Dublin, it was a lot different. They were coming up against the All-Ireland champions. Dublin were massive favourites. Coincidentally, the final a year previous, a lot more people felt that Louth would give this more of a go. But this game was a lot closer, and it was a 4-point game in the end. And I remember being there on Croke Park and thinking, Louth should have won that game. They had multiple chances. It went down to 4 points. And even at the end of the game, I remember looking at some of the Louth players and their faces at full time. They looked absolutely distraught because they believed that they were there to win the game. And the more the time went on, the better Louth would go. I mean, they beat Cork, obviously, in the championship as well that year, which was absolutely huge, getting to a quarter-final. They were beaten fairly comfortably by Donegal, but they certainly did when they scored 118 that day, which was a very impressive tally to kick. And that was the thing with this Louth side. You could see them drop back and be very defensive. You could see them keep the ball, but you could see them also as well attack in numbers when they needed to as well. They would, revert to multiple different types of systems. And I think Ger Brennan has shown himself to be a very, very smart coach in the way that Louth football play football. And I think that was very evident to see in 2024, and it was very evident to see at times in 2025 as well. And then this year, and this year is obviously fresh in the memory. I mean, they stay up relatively comfortably in the end in Division 2. They beat Meath on the final day as well. They've had a very good record actually against Meath over the last couple of years, coincidentally. And then in Leinster, look, you're thinking, what can happen in the Leinster Championship? I think everyone is expecting Dublin to go and win it again. They get beat by Meath, which was incredible in its own right. And without question, despite Meath losing in that Leinster final, that still is a phenomenal achievement and deserves its own respect and recognition, in my opinion. But Louth were waiting in the long grass. And so often in history, in football, where we've saw the big team get beat by the lesser team, and then the lesser team is going into the final now as the sort of bigger team or the favourite in some ways. And although Meath weren't massive favourites going into this game, probably marginal favourites, and even at that, I don't even know if they were favourites, to be honest with you. I didn't see the bookies' odds. I backed Louth to win the game, to be fair, and I know a few others did as well. But Louth did it, and they showed there's been this fight as well about Louth, and I think maybe it stems again from the Ger Brennan aspect, or the fact that Louth have always had to fight. They've always had to work that bit harder maybe than other teams to get what they want. But you saw that in the game, the way that they would fight. And they'd never lie down as well. In that first half versus Meath, they only kicked 3 points, but they got 3 goals. And they stood up when they needed to keep themselves in it, to give themselves a fighting chance. And then in the second half, when they needed to keep the ball, when they needed to control the game, they would do so absolutely brilliantly. And their midfield as well was absolutely outstanding. I mean, Tommy Durnan, I think, deserves a statue in Louth, probably alongside Samuel Roy, maybe alongside Ger Brennan at this stage as well. Louth got over the line. They got their moment. They won their first Leinster Senior Football Championship since 1957, 68 years, kind of remarkable, incredible, and an unbelievable achievement, I think, for Louth football to have gone and done that. And it is kind of mad to think that whilst the likes of Meath were maybe complaining about Dublin's dominance and Andy McEntee was going on the Sunday game, whilst Glenn Ryan was, coming out after matches and saying that Dublin have a huge favourable advantage in Croke Park and they're too strong in Leinster and everything else. And whilst even some Westmeath players, as I was saying, were writing open letters to Croke Park, Louth never once complained. They never once kicked up a fuss. And maybe some would say they didn't have a right to, maybe given their history and everything else in comparison to teams like Meath and Kildare. Although Kildare really, they've only won one Leinster title this century as well. And that was right at the start of it. But Louth got on with it. And whilst everyone else was complaining about Dublin's dominance, Louth were building something of their own. And it felt almost like they were doing it quietly. There wasn't a huge fuss. And I think Samuel Roy's even said as well that the outside noise hasn't been able to get into the Louth camp. And they seem like such a tight-knit group. And I do honestly, genuinely believe that since Ger Brennan has come in as manager, he set out the stalwart to win the Leinster title. He didn't come in for them to just compete and to make up the numbers. Like, he genuinely said, we are winning this Leinster Senior Football Championship. And he did, and it's an incredible achievement. And as I was saying, it is only one part of the story, because you have the under-20s as well, who won their first Leinster Championship in 44 years, which is absolutely extraordinary there. And they've just been building, and whatever's been happening behind the scenes with underage, with facilities, with keeping players on side, with development squads, Louth have set a bit of a precedent, in my opinion. I think the likes of, as I said, the so-called smaller counties, your Wicklows, your Carlows, Longford, Leitrim, maybe even in Ulster, the likes of Antrim and these kind of counties, I think they should look at Louth as the blueprint. And part of me often wonders if Louth even took anything from Monaghan. It's two counties that are very, very close to each other. Monaghan have had a very kind of similar story themselves. And it's been remarkable to see what Louth have actually achieved, and why I think that this could even propel even further into maybe more Leinster titles and possibly even at a push at an All-Ireland, is because you have the under-20 players coming through. You have the core players that they have right now in Samuel Roy, in Craig Lennon, in Conor Grimes, these lads. And look, these lads won't be around forever, but you'll have the under-20 lads who can come in and support them. You've got a minor team there potentially coming up as well. Now, look, underage doesn't always translate into senior success, but I think Louth have the blueprint, and they're able to introduce these players. And even if Ger Brennan was to leave Louth, and let's say he does go to Dublin or he goes to another county, or maybe he just doesn't fancy it anymore, I don't know what happens. Louth will find someone else and they'll keep being successful, in my opinion, because the culture and the standards around the county are at a very, very high right now. And you can see it when any of them do interviews, and you can just see it the way they are on the pitch as well. And let's not forget as well that Louth as well, if all this wasn't good enough, they've also got a new stadium on the way in Dundalk. Like, funding has now been commissioned for that as well. You can imagine the boost that's going to give Louth football as well, because you feel like that's the one thing now that they're missing, isn't it? It's a proper GAA stadium. Maybe hurling might even, take off a little bit more in the county as well. Maybe ladies football as well. Who knows? But yeah, like, this is going to give Louth an astronomical boost, in my opinion. And, even the kids and everything else who would have been in Crow Park witnessing that happen, absolutely phenomenal. Because let's not forget as well, Louth, generally speaking, has been very much a soccer county, you would say, over the last 20 years or so. And we saw that with Dundalk and even Drogheda United. To think Drogheda as well won the FAI Cup as well. I mean, what a year it must be to be from Drogheda. I'd be curious to know people's opinions, thoughts, and everything else on it. I am delighted for Louth Football. I'm delighted it's them as well, because as I said before, as a dub, having seen Meath and Kildare and these other counties sort of complain so much about Dublin having so much resources and being so far ahead, it is kind of funny to see that it's actually Louth, who've never once complained about anything before, actually come along and do it. And I know Louth didn't beat Dublin, but honestly, if Louth were playing Dublin in that game in Port East, they would have beat them. I've absolutely no doubts about it. And look, there is a scenario with the group stages. Louth finished second, Dublin finished third. It could happen. And then we'll obviously see what happens there. But yeah, just remarkable stuff there. But let me know your thoughts, your opinions on the rise of Louth football over the last couple of seasons. Are there any points that you think that I've missed here? Anyway, we'll wrap this up here. And until the next one, speak to you all soon.